Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today's episode will cover a wild week in European politics. First, we'll talk about the results from the European parliamentary elections, where the far right made some gains, but failed to deliver a decisive blow to the incumbent centrist coalition. It's looking good for von der Leyen to be Commission president yet again. Then we will turn to a bold move by French President Emmanuel Macron, who shocked all of Europe and maybe the world, to dissolve parliament and call a snap election after his liberal Renaissance party fared incredibly poorly in the European parliamentary elections. And finally, we will turn to a conversation with Lieutenant General Michiel van der Laan, the Director General of the EU military staff, for a conversation on the EU's evolving role in defense policy and military affairs. It's a really interesting conversation. All right, Donatien, let's get to it. So European parliamentary elections, 450 million people or so go to the polls and vote in all these different countries. It's sort of impossible to follow, but what happened? What's your main takeaway?
This is kind of our Super Bowl over here every 5 years. There's a lot of people in a lot of countries. So as you said in the intro, it's a mixed picture. So there were a lot of announcements ahead of time because of the polling that the far right was going to sweep the board in a lot of places. It did that in a couple really important countries like France and Germany, and we'll talk about France in a little bit. But the picture is a lot more mixed than we were all expecting, at least based on the polling. So yes, the far right did incredibly well in France. The AfD in Germany is really a concerning score. But we're seeing some pretty interesting stories about the success of the center in places like Spain, like Poland. The geographical distribution of the center and the far right is also pretty different. I think that's also why a lot of commentators are focusing on France and Germany, is because this is big fish, right? But there's actually a lot of medium-sized and smaller countries that didn't see this. Also in Slovakia, good news as well. Fico's party didn't do that well. It was not in first place. Same thing in Portugal, when we had seen Chega do really well in the last elections. Not really the case this time around. And then I will finish, as always, by mentioning Hungary, because I'm contractually obligated to mention Hungary. Fidesz had 44%, which is still 11 seats out of 21 for Hungary, but it was a lot less than his 52% last time around. And a new party from someone who used to be aligned with Viktor Orbán had 30%. This is the Respect and Freedom Party, but that means 7 seats that will not go to Viktor Orbán's party. And that's pretty significant.
Yeah. And also, the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, who won the Dutch election late last year and is about to form a government, his party didn't finish first. It was the Socialist Green Alliance. And also in Scandinavia, there was, where far-right parties had become essentially either part of government or propping up the existing government, it had modest declines, but this wasn't a case of the far-right going up and up and up. And I think it raises a lot of questions about how European parties can approach the far right going forward, something we can maybe talk about in a bit when we talk about France. But I guess when we turn to what does this then mean for the next European Commission, because that's really what's on the line here. Everyone goes to vote, you vote for a European Parliament, and their major task is effectively voting and confirming the nominees for Commission roles, in particular von der Leyen, but down the line. And I think it now looks quite likely that we're going to have a fair amount of continuity with the previous Commission. There's a larger far-right contingent, but it's not that organized. And the Greens, while they got sort of walloped, I think are being very pragmatic and have sort of announced that they're going to support von der Leyen. And the EPP did quite well, and the Socialists did as well as they did last time. So there's now essentially, a strong left, center, right bloc that will likely bring von der Leyen back and probably make it so maybe there's some rollback of some parts of the Green New Deal or the Green Deal, but it's largely going to stay intact.
Yeah, the good news for Ursula von der Leyen, too, is that, I mean, we all remember right before the election, she made some waves about opening the door to maybe some kind of cooperation with the ECR, which is the right to far right wing grouping in the European Parliament. Giorgia Meloni's party, for example, is an ECR. But then that obviously created a lot of problems for some parts of her EPP party. And right after the election, it became clear that she doesn't really have to do that anymore. She's not as much stuck between the two camps, and she can present a program that is pretty center-right, after all. I agree with you that in terms of Green Deal, we might still see some shaving of the corners here and there on land use or even combustion engine, but maybe not as much as we were expecting if the ECR had done better than it did.
Yeah, and we should mention that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, her party, Brothers of Italy, she outperformed, she improved her total. So she did quite well in the European parliamentary elections. But in some ways, Meloni, I think, is sort of an example of the normalization of the far right, but in part because Meloni has sort of dropped the far part and just sort of become right. I wouldn't call Meloni center-right at all. It's sort of a non-anti-European right wing. And so there's not a deep concern about her situation on what that means for the future of the European Union. As you noted, von der Leyen doesn't look like she even needs to rely on Meloni's support. I will note that one of the challenges will be for von der Leyen is within her own EPP, where, you know, there is a broad spectrum of parties on the center right, with some would prefer more of a union with the ECR than working with the socialists again.
Some do, but at the same time, parts of the EPP that were pretty difficult, let's say, for von der Leyen, including around the time the EPP voted her back in as the next leader, for example, the French Les Républicains were the ones voting against. They lost seats. They're at like 6 now. So their power within the grouping has really become much smaller. That is something that we see, for example, in other parts of France and for Germany as well. Like Renew, Macron's party, has a much smaller size within Renew now. Olaf Scholz's party has a much smaller size inside the SD. So the power dynamic has changed a lot inside those groups as well. And it'll be interesting to see if that drags the consensus towards places like Spain or Portugal. And the last thing I want to note on the groupings in the parliament, because I think that will affect also some of the votes that are coming, is we've also talked about the whole non-aligned, non-affiliated parties. That's a pretty big group. We're counting about 90 unattached MEPs at the moment. At first, I thought most of them were at risk of joining far-right groupings. That's not really the case when you look at the numbers in more detail, because 15 are AfD, which is not ideal. But in Italy, remember the Five Star Movement? They have 8 seats that are in that group, and they're definitely not on the far right. So we're going to see an alignment that will also look different, and von der Leyen's more centrist parts of the agenda will be able to rely on the support of some of those non-affiliated members.
I think let's turn to the big topic that emerged the night of European parliamentary elections when Emmanuel Macron sort of shocked everyone and called for dissolved parliament and called for new snap elections, which are going to take place on June 30th, and then the runoff will be on July 7th. And this, I think, is an incredibly bold move. And I have to say, I think it might be a smart one. The reaction on Twitter and the reaction from many in Europe has been utter disgust and shock at Macron's decision. But I think there's some wisdom here. But maybe I'll turn it to you first. Maybe you could outline what's taken place over the last week in a crazy week of French politics, and then how you sort of view the situation.
Crazy indeed. I got a text from a friend yesterday who's American, who's like, hey, what's happening in France right now? Oh, well, how much time you got? So yes, since he called that election, and we should be very clear, these are legislative elections. Emmanuel Macron is not resigning. He has made very clear that even if his party does not do well in the legislative election, the snap elections, he will not resign. So let me just put that out there. First, it's really important. Not that the assembly doesn't have power. It has a lot of power, but this is a pretty strong presidential system, and him staying at the helm matters. That's the first thing. Immediately after that, we saw a scramble among the political parties in France. On the one hand, you have the left wing, which goes from the Socialist Party, which you could say it's center left, all the way to France Insoumise, which is Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party. By American standards, they're far left. And they've created a renamed coalition that they kind of ran in the last presidential election, but that didn't work amazing. And that's called the Popular Front. And they've been doing pretty well. They were in line really quickly. So Macron announced this on a Sunday evening. By, say, Tuesday, the left-wing coalition was ready to say, we've agreed on terms. Here's how we're going to divide up all the different jurisdictions. We're going to run one candidate for the whole coalition, each of these. So the ranks there are aligned, and that's pretty impressive, and that's already benefiting them. On the right side of the spectrum, it is pandemonium. So, I mean, Macron's coalition is what it is. They're going to try to reconduct all the MPs that they currently have. Among Les Républicains, which is a right-wing party, it used to be one of the two main government parties. That's Nicolas Sarkozy, that's Jacques Chirac. It's just huge members of the French political elite. De Gaulle, exactly. The head of Les Républicains, Éric Ciotti, who's always been quite right-wing, even for his members, although, well, I should say the electeds from Les Républicains. The base is a little more on the right. Just announced that he was looking at an alliance with Marine Le Pen's national rally. And that blew up because all the elected officials jumped on this and said, absolutely not. We have to hold the line. This is the cordon sanitaire that we've all heard about. And that really blew up in his face because as much as the base supports him, those officials said, absolutely not. We're not doing this. And he was voted out of the party chairmanship. And he's now going through the judicial system to try to annul this decision. That's like a whole can of worms, and we don't need to get into that. And finally, on the far right, you have the National Rally that's just they're looking at their amazing score from the European elections. And they've already announced Jordan Bardella, who is Marine Le Pen's right-hand man, who's been at the head of the ticket for the European elections, has already announced our main opposition, our main contenders are the left-wing coalition. So he's making a big announcement that he doesn't think the center or the right wing is even a serious contenders, even though obviously he's open to an alliance with the Républicains. So right wing, not doing great. Left wing, really aligned, but we'll see if that convinces people. And the last thing I'll say on this, and I'll let you come in, Max, sorry, is from the outside, I think there's been a lot of hot air and panic. I think it's two things are true at once. One, that this election is important, but it's not like a Brexit level kind of announcement. And two, that inside France, this is a really, really concerning moment. Like a lot of people in France are really worried about what that means if the far right comes in. These are people who were collaborators under the Nazi regime and the occupation of France. That's where the roots are for this party. So I don't want to minimize that either, but the impact of the election itself on, let's say, foreign policy or anything like that is not as big as some commentators have mentioned.
Yeah, I think the concern on the European level is that, Macron would still be president. There would be something, that the French have cohabitation, which is you're basically divorced but married and have to live together. The concern would be, okay, Macron would, attend European Council meetings, would sort of be the president of France, could direct the military. But at the European level, it really intermixes foreign and domestic policy. So the whole budgetary implications, would the far right sort of try to starve the EU budget, do certain things like that? It could really complicate the situation. But maybe let's get back to the kind of tactical decision here and why Macron did it. I think the first thing I should say, this is all Macron's fault on the one hand. And it's his fault because when he won in 2017, and you can't really fault him for this, he saw a huge political opening, which was to destroy the two-party system, which was to take the votes from the socialists and from the Republicans on the center right and to create a centrist party that would dominate the center and therefore ideally be very large and which would be the majority and could win. The problem is that when you occupy the center as a centrist party, where does the opposition come from? It's a democracy. There's got to be opposition. So it comes from either the far right or the far left. And so you have Le Pen and you have Mélenchon. And so the far right and far left start doing well. And Macron is now in year 7. People are sick of him. People are tired of him domestically. And so when he calls this vote, you can just sort of sense the kind of like guttural within French society and in Brussels. I ultimately think this is, a smart tactical decision. And we won't fully know until the vote happens. But the reason why is because it seemed like this was going to happen anyway. There's a lot of talk that within the next year there's going to be a fight over the next French budget. Macron would have to take unusual actions to get that passed. There would be a vote of disapproval. And Macron would potentially be in a position where he'd be having to dissolve parliament.
The parliamentary procedure that you just mentioned in passing of having to take special measures to push a law through, he's already used, multiple of his governments have already used this too many times. In terms of just legitimacy for the legislative process, it's already been diminished. And he already did a swap around where he put in a new prime minister earlier this year. So he can't even rely on that.
I think the basic thing is that the confrontation with this rising far right was going to happen again and again and again, right? And so Macron, in the presidential level, it's advantageous because you get into the runoff, everyone holds their nose and votes against Le Pen and votes for Macron. Everyone talked about how the last election was very close because Le Pen got over 40%, but Macron got close to 60%. In American perspective, well, that's not that close. But I think what's important here is I think what you're beginning to see is the return of the party system in France, where occupying the center, Macron is getting squeezed on both sides. I think it's good that the left has united. And what I think he's done is really focused everyone's mind, right? Oh my God, this could actually happen. We could have the far right, and that would be dramatic things would happen for France. We're seeing the markets freak out. The spread between French debt and German debt is increasing. And there's a real sense of anxiety, I think, not among the far right, but amongst, I think everyone else in France about where the situation is headed. And that's beneficial because it's the counter mobilization, which we didn't see in the European parliamentary elections, where it was seen as sort of a free hit on Macron, and everyone's like, okay, let's whack away. But now I think what you'll end up seeing is, I don't know how well the far right's going to do. I think the left bloc, the new Popular Front, may do quite well. And there may be kind of, the center and the left then have to work together. I could see this coming out in a way that is not as dire as people say. And the big confrontation is going to be 2027, and better to sort of focus the minds now and begin to sort of put the pieces in place for a post-Macron future. So I think everyone is right to sort of be annoyed with Macron, but it's the byproduct
When are they not?
Yeah, but it's sort of the byproduct of what he did in 2017. And I almost think that moving the confrontation up to right now and not allowing the far right to sort of celebrate their victory has some real tactical benefits. And that's exactly what Pedro Sanchez did last year. And the far right has been deeply diminished in Spain in some ways because of it. A year ago, they did quite well in Spain. They got up to 20% of the vote in legislative elections. He immediately called for elections and stayed in office and diminished the far right. And we'll see. It could be a new model for how to approach this.
And there are tactical benefits, but I want to make one last point, too, on the institutional perspective. Because in the last two times, in 2017 and 2022, part of the dynamic was that we had the presidential election and then legislative elections right after. The last time around, Macron's majority was vastly diminished, but when you do that, everyone's focus is on the presidential. Here, the focus is entirely on the National Assembly. And in a way, it could be a way to remind voters, hey, it's not just the president that matters. The way you build a coalition and a majority inside the National Assembly is crucial as well. And we need you to remember what your legislative body does and why it's important to vote for that one as well and to care about who's in power there, because it's not just the president. So having that focus just on the assembly and not the presidential, I think it's potentially institutional support or institutional trust benefits as well.
But maybe with that, we'll transition to our interview with Lieutenant General van der Laan.
We are thrilled to welcome Lieutenant General Michiel van der Laan to the Eurofile. Lieutenant General van der Laan is the Director General of the EU Military Staff. In the European External Action Service, he holds two strategic functions, the Director General EU Military Staff and the Director EU Military Planning and Conduct Capability, which is the EU HQ in Brussels. Hence, he's in charge for all EU military conceptual and operational activities, holds command over all EU-led military missions, including in Ukraine, and supports the EU Military Committee as the body of the Chiefs of Defense for EU member states. Lieutenant General, welcome to the Eurofile.
Thank you very much.
So let's start by setting the stage a little bit. Our podcast really tries to translate sometimes some of the inner workings of the EU to an American audience. And many of our listeners might not be super familiar with your job title, the remit of your role. So could you describe what the Director General of the EU Military Staff does and what is the EU Military Staff?
I think in your introduction you already explained a little bit. To elaborate a little bit more, my position is to advise the military committee and also to inform the political security committee, which is the committee of the 27 ambassadors of the 27 member states. At the same time, as you mentioned, I'm the mission commander for all European missions abroad, but also for the European mission on European soil in support of Ukraine. And I try to connect what is happening on the ground with the political reality and vice versa.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about Ukraine and what the EU is doing and what you're doing in the training mission. That strikes me as incredibly important. NATO doesn't have a training mission. It's the EU that is training tens of thousands of Ukrainians. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how that mission has come about, how it's going, and where you sort of see its trajectory going forward.
Of course, I think it's a very successful mission until now. It's a mission where 24 out of 27 member states are actively involved. We are conducting training on European soil with 2 subordinated commands in Germany and in Poland. So the majority of the training is done on Polish and German soil, but also in Spain, in France, in Italy, Czech Republic, Slovakia. So almost all 24 member states also facilitating training on their soil. We have been training about 53,000 soldiers now, and we will reach 60,000 by summer, which I think is a big achievement. But more important is that we are not happy with that one, but the Ukrainians are very happy with our efforts. And the fact that they are coming back to us every time with new requirements and new trainees is very important.
When you say new requirements that Ukraine is coming back to you with, what does that mean?
We have to adapt almost on a weekly basis. So there are new needs, there are new soldiers coming, but the art of war is changing almost every week. Ukraine then adapts their requirements. They want to have a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that one. Sometimes we have to establish new training modules. So that's the flexibility that is required from our side based on what they ask us.
In addition to Ukraine, what else is sort of keeping you stay late at the office? The EU has a new mission in the Red Sea. Is that a major focus? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and maybe perhaps some of the other EU military missions that are taking place around the world.
It's not limited to this, but I will mention 4 examples which are keeping me busy. There are 4 things that are more or less directly threatening Europe and its citizens. The one is already mentioned, it's the war in Ukraine, which could lead to a more physical threat also to EU countries. Second one is, as you mentioned, the situation in the Red Sea, where Houthis are threatening civil merchant shipping, which costs the EU 200 to 300 million per day if we are not securing these ships. So that's why we started the Operation Aspides mid of February alongside the American Operation Prosperity Guardian to make sure that ships can cross the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. A third one I would like to mention is the situation in Africa, where we see that there are more and more actors filling the vacuum, as I call it. So I'm talking about Russia, I'm talking about China, I'm talking about Iran and some other actors. And the threat that is coming from that is that more and more migrants will also go to Europe, which is not a bad thing because I think we need the working force. But with mass migration comes terrorism and criminality. That's what we don't need in Europe at the moment. And then I came back last week from Western Balkans. Western Balkans is also something that needs more attention because the Russians are using this as their front yard for hybrid warfare. And I see that some tensions are returning in the Balkans, fueled by Russia.
Speaking of the Balkans, you have a long and decorated career, but some of it was spent in Bosnia, if I read that correctly. You've also served in Afghanistan, but that was under a NATO banner. I'm curious how you would characterize the EU's evolving role in that kind of military mission, that kind of space. You just talked about a lot of places in the world, and you talked about in the Red Sea, having an operation alongside the U.S. operation. How do you see that role evolving over the last, say, decade?
Well, I think there are 2 developments that force the EU to do more. The one is the situation in the world, because there are so many crises as we speak, and we just mentioned a couple of them. And the other one is, based on that, we want to be more independent of our partners. And also because our partners deserve that we do more. For example, for me, NATO is the one and only organization that has to deal with collective defense. The cooperation with our partners in NATO is the best thing we ever did. At the same time, we need to do more as European countries in NATO to contribute more. The next one is that we need to do more in the surroundings of Europe, which is not a NATO task per se. So we need to be more self-sustaining in those missions and operations. So at the end, we need to step up in our capability development and our engagement in missions and operations.
Let me ask about the NATO-EU dynamic and the question that comes up all the time. I think in Washington, some people might scratch their head that the EU doesn't do defense. Why are you here? But how is the NATO-EU relationship? And how do you see the EU and NATO working together? We don't have that dreaded duplication that the United States is always nervous about. And how do you see when people say the EU is duplicating NATO, what do you say in response?
Well, the NATO-EU cooperation and EU-NATO cooperation is going well. I think we managed to do a lot of things together or complementary the last years with the crisis we had, the COVID crisis in Afghanistan, if you would call it like that, the war in Ukraine and the support of Ukraine. So we're working very well together, but there's always room for improvement. Now, the fear of duplication, I don't see that as an issue because we are not duplicating in the EU. So as I said before, collective defense is a NATO task and will never be, as I think, an EU task. At the same time, we need to have, for example, a proper adult C2 structure to conduct EU-led missions and operations. Because if we are not able to do that, we cannot deploy forces. So it's not about duplication, it's about complementary. And it's not much, by the way. We're not talking about a NATO command structure with about 10,000 officers and NCOs. We are talking here about, for example, a military planning and conduct capability of 115 soldiers, which is peanuts.
And one of the major developments from the strategic compass, which was the EU's sort of European security strategy, was to create a rapid deployment capacity. In some ways, this came out of Afghanistan with this realization that Europe needed an ability to get out EU citizens to be able to respond to crises that sort of fell well below the threshold of a collective defense action. How is the RDC or the rapid deployment capacity coming along? And is there concerns that you are hearing at all from NATO countries, from the United States, from here in Washington, that maybe this takes away from NATO forces? How's it going? And are you hearing any complaints about duplication with that?
Well, the answer is yes and yes. So it's going well, yes. And sometimes I hear these concerns, but nobody should be concerned about that one. So when we talk about the rapid deployment capacity, we're talking about a force to be deployed existing of about 5,000 soldiers, compared to NATO, who is planning to deploy, in case of collective defense, 300,000 soldiers. So in numbers, this is really a small investment. We are doing well. The rapid deployment capacity will be full operational capable by the beginning of next year, which means we will have a proper C2 in place. We will have a European battle group as core of the rapid deployment capacity on standby, and we will be able to add to that EUBG, European battle group, additional assets if required. So it's looking well. At the same time, we are developing scenarios because in order to be able to react fast, the best way is to do it based on scenarios and based on planning, and we work on that one too. So nobody should be concerned about it. Everybody should be happy about it, because it would mean that we could deal with some issues ourselves instead of asking our partners to do so.
When there's a lot of ambition coming out of Brussels, coming out of some other capitals to do more. Some of the proposals floating out there, one of them in particular is this idea of a defense commissioner in the next commission, which should come pretty soon since we're just coming out of elections. What do you think are implications for EU military activities if that's the case? Is it just title that is just another commissioner who would be doing the work that is already being done? Or is that the signal for something significantly different for military activities?
The implications would be that I hope that it will improve the situation. So there will be no implications or complications, but there will be improvement. I think the real reason is that until 2 years ago, the defense part, and especially the military part, was a very small part within the EU, where we see now it's one of the main efforts. Support Ukraine, we were talking about the threat coming from the Houthis, Africa. At the same time, there is a requirement to have more capabilities, more equipment, more ammunition, more interoperability. So there's a need for the European defense industry to ramp up, to produce more the same stuff, to enable the military to conduct our mission operations. So it depends on the task for this EU commissioner, and we will see. It could be a defense minister-like position. It could also be somebody who has to deal with the ramping up of the defense industry.
On the defense industry side, there's been an EU defense industrial strategy that was released by the Commission, and I think will be a topic of conversation. I know that's not directly your remit, but it does strike me that when we're talking about a rapid deployment capacity and other assets that Europe may lack and that may be relying on the United States, is part of what you're focused on is sort of identifying maybe capabilities that European militaries need to produce so that the EU can actually do some of these actions that it's trying to do. Are your capabilities you're setting out, are they linked with what you hope you'll see on the defense industrial side?
Of course. I mean, for the military, the highest priority is to be effective. And to be effective, you need to have access to all these capabilities you need to conduct your missions operations. Now, it doesn't mean that you always have to own them. At least you have to have access to. So we could also go for smart solutions. For example, we have the European Air Transport Command in Eindhoven, the Netherlands, where we have a pool of strategic lift, which works fine. Of course, we have some shortfalls, but the best way to solve that one is to step up as European countries, EU countries, within the NATO structures based on the NATO defense planning process. So the shortfalls in the NATO defense planning process should be filled as much as possible by EU countries, from my perspective. At the same time, serving then the EU, because then you would have more availability and access to these assets.
If I could just follow up on that, the NATO-EU cooperation, I completely agree with you that duplication isn't really an issue. We should stop worrying about it. But there is an issue of just, the EU and NATO, the bureaucratic friction. You have the Turkey-Cyprus challenge of preventing a degree of cooperation. It seems like there may be a lot of duplication happening just because the two organizations aren't integrating or aren't working well together. Is there a lot that needs to be done to improve that collaboration? Is the Turkey-Cyprus issue something that diplomats here should try to tackle? That should be higher on the agenda? How do you see the NATO-EU relationship?
Well, you have the wrong person for this question, because you should ask some diplomats. So this can only be solved by politicians and diplomats, not by soldiers.
But that's making your life more difficult, right? That the diplomats should be tackling this issue because there's some just practical impediments that are hindering your ability to work.
Of course, it would ease my life. At the same time, we will find workarounds if necessary, but that is not always efficient. But it is an issue that cannot be solved by soldiers. By the way, soldiers from these nations and member states work close together, shoulder to shoulder in mission operations. So there is no issue. It's a political thing.
Maybe one final question. US-EU relations, particularly on the military side. You're here in Washington. What is the state of US-EU military relationship? Is that a relationship that's developing, or would you describe the relationship as strong? Or how have your meetings here in Washington, what's your kind of takeaway for how US views the EU as a military actor?
I think some of my colleagues see the EU military as something which has a kind of potential for the future. They are interested in working close together with us. And actually we are practicing that at the moment. For example, the two operations in the Red Sea, as I mentioned before. But we, the EU, we have to do some work here to also inform and explain. And so that's why I'm here. I'm here not only to gain something, but especially also to bring something, which means to inform people, to explain to them, like I did before to you, so that they get more insights about what the EU military is, what we are able to do, where we're heading for, and that we are not the enemy, but that we are a strong partner for the future.
And that takes time, I think. Max can speak to this better than I can, but from inside the U.S. government, there's decades of learned attitudes towards the EU, or just decades of ignoring it, that probably need to be unlearned or overwritten.
Yes, but never waste a good crisis. We have some crisis at the moment, and we should use it also in a positive way to enable this cooperation.
And at a moment where there's a lot of spotlight on the US-EU relationship, on NATO with the 75th coming up. So perfect time to do this. Well, Lieutenant General, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on the Eurofile. I hope your meetings have been go well in the next few days. And thanks again for stopping by.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer, Sean Falk, and to Otto Svensson for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.